They called the police on my autistic daughter for playing violin in our backyard, but they didn't know who they were really messing with. What would you do if your HOA president attempted to evict your disabled child, only to discover you're a US Marshal with the right to stand up to them? I never thought that a simple violin would cause a neighborhood war, but that's exactly what happened when my daughter Emma's music came under our HOA president's crusade. "Daddy, look," Emma squealed, clutching her acceptance letter I received in the youth orchestra. Her hazel eyes sparkled with a joy that I hadn't witnessed since her mother passed last year for a 12-year-old child with autism. This was not merely a success, but a breakthrough. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." I mentioned spinning her around our new kitchen. We had just relocated to Maple Ridge Estates 3 months prior, in hope of a new beginning. I'd accepted a temporary desk job with the US Marshals to be more available to EM, but kept my occupation a secret. In my experience, individuals behave differently when there are law enforcement officers present that night. Emma played her violin in our backyard as golden light drizzled over our patio. The music wasn't that great. She was practicing a difficult piece, but her determination made my heart swell with pride. A sudden knock shattered our moment. I opened the front door to find a face pinched and holding a clipboard wearing a navy blazer in the middle of summer heat. "Mr. Tom TNPS son, I'm Deborah Miller, HOA president." Her smile never reached her eyes. "We need to discuss the noise coming from your property." I asked her nicely though. My stomach nodded my daughter's practicing violin. It's during the noise ordinance time, the covenants clearly state no disturbing noises that interfere with neighbors' peaceful enjoyment. She pushed a paper in my face. 3 distant homes complained about the SC squealing. My jaw was tightening. It's not squealing. Emma's autistic and music calms her down. She just formed the youth orchestra. Deborah's face didn't unwind. "I understand disabilities, Mr. Thompson. But there are guidelines for everyone's benefit. Perhaps she could practice in the house or school. Her sensory issues make that difficult." "The acoustics, that sounds like a personal issue, not an HOA issue." Deborah interrupted me, standing up straighter. "I'm sending a formal notice. Next time will be a $100 fee, which doubles each subsequent time after she had left." I ran into Emma, hiding in the hallway, her face pale. "Am I in jail, Dad?" "No, sweetheart." I hugged her tight. Some people just don't get it yet. I built Emma a practice corner in our garage, but the insulation was not enough. Another warning was posted on our door the following week at the monthly HOA meeting. I tried to reason with the board. The Americans with Disabilities Act provides for reasonable accommodations. The ADA does not trump private contractual arrangements you made when you purchased your home. Deborah interrupted, not having the courtesy to look up from her notes. Next item. I looked into incessantly that night, printing property maps and bylaws. There was something off about this whole situation. The next day I spoke to our neighbor, Mrs. Garcia, a retired woman who grew roses on the other side of our fence. "Do you think the violin practices are too loud?" I asked. Frankly, she seemed surprised. "Oh no, I think it's lovely. Reminds me of my granddaughter." "Why?" The HOA claims a number of neighbors complained. Mrs. Garcia scowled. "The only complainant is Deborah. Her husband departed a year ago, and ever since then, she meandered off. Looking embarrassed, the fines commenced arriving weekly. $1,100, then $200, then $400. Emma began having meltdowns before practice, associating her beloved violin with distress. My heart broke watching her rock back and forth, hands over ears. "Maybe I should resign," she whispered one night. "No. Honey, we not giving up." I grasped her shoulders lightly. "You have every right to play." I put a camera on our back porch after discovering Emma's music stand had been knocked over the footage. Caught Deborah herself entering our yard when we were away inspecting our patio and taking pictures. When I walked up to her, she didn't even deny it as HOA president. I have inspection rights for covenant violations. Not in surprise and not to invade, touch my daughter's things once more. And we'll discuss this again. Her eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me, Mr. Thompson?" "I'm drawing a line," I replied calmly. something you seem to have difficulty with the following Saturday. Emma worked on a new work that included higher notes within 20 minutes. A police cruiser pulled into our driveway, lights flashing, but sirens mercifully silent. Emma's bow was trembling over strings. Dad, go on playing, sweetie. This is just a miscommunication, officer. Reyes, a young police officer, looked embarrassed. We had a disturbance report. Someone had called in a child in distress behind him. I saw Deborah watching from her front porch, arms crossed with satisfaction. My daughter is autistic and plays violin, I explained, keeping my voice steady. Would you like to greet her? The officer glanced at Emma, who had returned to the porch steps. Rocking slowly, his face relaxed. No need to disturb her, just checking the welfare call, as he turned to exit, then paused. You know, my brother's kid is on the spectrum, plays drums, drives my parents crazy. But it's his thing, you know. I nodded, grateful for the short moment of understanding. That night, I received an email from the HOA board subject line notice of lien proceedings. The fines had added up to $1,200, and they were going to place a lien on our house. Emma caught me staring at my laptop, my hands shaking with hardly suppressed anger. Are we losing the house, Dad? Her voice was little afraid. I closed the laptop and took a deep breath. The HOA had no clue who they were playing with as a deputy US Marshal. I'd stood eye to eye with toughened criminals and protected fragile witnesses. I knew how to battle within the system and emerge victorious. No, Emma, we aren't losing everything. I wrapped my arms tightly around her. But it's time they realized who they were playing with. You did not warn me you were calling the police. I hissed at Deborah at the emergency HOA meeting she'd convened about the Thompson incident. A welfare check is not the police. She shot back loudly enough for everyone to hear. I'd been concerned about the alarming sounds coming from your backyard. 30 neighbors sat in folding chairs at the community center, watching our conversation like a tennis match. Emma sat beside me, headphones on, sketching in her sketchbook. To stay calm in the hectic room, my daughter was playing the violin. I told the audience instead of Deborah. She's autistic and music helps her process emotionally. Instead of speaking to us directly, some individuals chose to stoke the situation. Unnecessarily, a whisper spread around the room. I noticed many understanding glances in Emma's direction. The fact remains, Deborah continued banging her gavel for attention. That Thompson family has accumulated huge sums of fines for repeated noise violations. The board recommends starting lien proceedings if payment is not received within 7 days. That is when I played my first card before you vote. I said, rising slowly, you should know I've been taking recordings of noise levels during Emma practice sessions. I held up my phone. Never before have we exceeded the 65 decibel daytime threshold provided for in the town ordinance that is legally paramount. Over H bylaws, Deborah Face flushed our covenants, explicitly address. I'd also like to call the board's attention to Bylaw Enforcement Section 3.2. I proceeded peacefully with a highlighted document. It clearly states that complaints must be corroborated by no less than 2 board members. Prior to issuing fines was that procedure went in our case. The board members exchanged awkward glances. An older man cleared his throat. Mrs. Miller assured us the complaints were numerous and affirmed interesting. I placed a folder on the table because I've spoken with all of the neighbors surrounding our property. None of them complained. I have their sign statements with me. The room erupted into whispers. Deborah banged her gavel hard several times again. I continued when the commotion subsided. I've installed security cameras which caught Mrs. Miller visiting our property, uninvited or see when we were away, which in state law is trespassing. A tall man in the back got up. Is that right, Deborah? You visited their property as president of the board. I have inspection rights, she stuttered. Not without 48 hours. Our written notice, I clarified. It's in the same bylaws you're using against us. The meeting descended into disorder. Emma tugged at my sleeve, overwhelmed by the rising voices. I tightened her hand reassuringly. Let's continue this week, the vice president suggested. Looking grateful for a way out, we have to get through the evidence Mr. Thompson has presented as we left. A few neighbors approached us, greeting each other for the first time. "My grandson is on the spectrum," said Mrs. Rodriguez, patting Emma's arm. "He loves trains, gets all the sounds I teach piano at the community college." Another man said I'd be happy to work with Emma if she wants some training. The tide was shifting, but Deborah wasn't finished with us. 3 days later, another police vehicle arrived, this time with Deborah and a man in a suit who introduced himself as code enforcement officer. "We've had complaints of unauthorized structural modifications." He explained, flashing his badge specifically. "A sound booth in your garage." Emma, who was playing outside in the front yard, came running indoors in tears. I felt my professional cal slipping. "My daughter uses this garage nook to practice." I explained, flashing him the easy foam panels I'd erected. "These aren't structural changes, just temporary acoustic upgrades. Any permanent modifications require board approval." Deborah insisted on attempting to peer past me into the garage. The code officer shifted uneasily. "Sir, would you be interested if I just take a glance? Then let's put this matter behind me." I stepped aside, noting Deborah's self-satisfied expression. The officer examined the foam panels. "The tiny rug? The music stand, ma'am." He turned at last to Deborah. "These are not structural modifications under the building code. They are temporary fixtures, which don't require permits. But the HOA insists the HOA cannot impose requirements, contrary to county building codes." He cut in, clearly angry at being drawn into an absurd argument. "There's no infraction here, Deborah." Her face reddened an ominous shade. "This isn't finished." Thompson, after they left, I found Emma secreted in her closet, her violin clutched to her chest. "They're going to take my music away," she sobbed. I knelt down next to her. "No one is going to take your music away." I promised that evening. I vowed I'd played defense. Long enough time to show my hand the next morning. I put on my full US Marshal uniform for the first time since immigrating to Maple Ridge. Emma's eyes grew wide when I saw her at breakfast. "Are you returning to your former job?" Fear entered her tone. "No, sweetie, I'm still on desk duty, but today I need for people to know exactly who they're working with." I dropped Emma off at school, then drove straight to the regional HOA management company office. The receptionist's eyes darted to my badge, then my sidearm. "I have to speak with whoever is handling the Maple Ridge Estates account." I said officially that I am Deputy US Marshal James Thompson, and I'm there regarding ongoing harassment against my family. 5 minutes later, I was escorted to a conference room where an agitated manager introduced himself as Kevin Patel. "What can I do for you, Marshal Thompson?" I placed my folder on the table. "I am present here to complain about a pattern of discriminatory enforcement actions taken against my disabled daughter in violation of the Fair Housing Act, and that may well constitute harassment under federal law." His eyes bulged when I articulated the evidence: the targeted complaints, the unverified fines, the trespassing, the selective enforcement. "Our company simply administers the actions of the board," he stuttered. "We do not make policy, but you do have a statutory obligation to ensure that those policies do not violate federal law." I responded, "I've documented 7 separate instances of your company pursued enforcement actions, singling out my daughter's disability-related accommodation requests. I escalated over a formal complaint I'd filed. This is heading to the Department of Housing and Urban Development today, unless all the fines are dismissed and a written accommodation plan is approved." Kevin began sweating. "I'll have to talk to our legal department, do that." I told him, standing to leave, "You've got 48 hours before this is a federal case." As I was exiting, my phone rang with a text from an unknown caller. "This is Tyler Rodriguez, Channel 9. News got your email on HOA discrimination against disabled child. Interested in hearing your story, willing to speak." I smiled as I got into my vehicle. I hadn't called any news outlets, but clearly someone at that meeting had. The community was polarizing, and Deborah was losing ground fast. When I went to pick up Emma from school, her music teacher intercepted me. "Mr. Thompson, Emma spoke of some problems at home with her rehearsing. The music room is available after school 3 days a week. If she needs a safe haven," my throat constricted with surprise feeling. "Thank you, that means more than you'll ever know." Dad, Emma said on the way home, Jason from my class asked if I could teach him violin. His mom said I could practice at their house anytime for the first time in weeks. I saw real hope. We weren't alone in this fight anymore. As we pulled onto our street, I noticed a small group of people standing by our house. My first thought was that Deborah had gotten out of hand again, until I saw the homemade signs let Emma play. Read 1 being held by Mrs. Rodriguez. Music is not a crime stated another. Emma gasped beside me. Dad, look, a dozen neighbors stood in our front yard. Some familiar faces from the get-together, others strangers. And between the two, Officer Reyes, out of uniform, holding a violin case. What is going on? Emma whispered. I squeezed her hand. I think we're going to find out who our real neighbors are. Flashing cameras greeted me as I entered the community center for the emergency HOA meeting. Someone had tipped off the local news about the commotion in my neighborhood. My blood was raging, but I kept my face neutral as I fiddled with Emma's noise-canceling headphones. Daddy, are they mad at me? Emma whispered, her small fists wrapping around mine. No, sweetheart, they just don't understand yet. I vowed, though, my stomach turned with doubt within every seat was occupied neighbors I'd never addressed. 2 eyewitnesses who saw US exit their whispers, running amok at the front. Deborah Johnson stood along with 4 other HOA board members. A thick binder splayed open across her table. Her immaculately coiffed hair and pinched visage reminded me of hunters I chased in my business people who thought rules rendered them untouchable. As we hold this emergency session, Deborah announced with saccharine poison in her voice, I'd like to thank Channel 7 News for their interest in our community standards. She nodded toward a reporter in the corner. The Thompson situation has escalated. Beyond simple noise complaints on the projector screen behind her, photos of Emma playing VI appeared clearly taken with a zoom lens from Deborah's window. My daughter's face caught in mid-expression at the joy on her face. The crowd gave Drew a murk from the figures. We've had 17 complaints. Deborah kept on clicking through more surveillance-type photos. Property values at Pine Haven Estates have traditionally remained 15% higher than surrounding areas because of our rigid compliance with regulations. I could sense Emma pull on me, behind me feeling hostility even when wearing her headphones. Older man I recognized from 3 doors down stood up. I did not have any complaints, he said sternly. In fact, I prefer to hear the music. Deborah's smile narrowed. Thank you, Mr. Rivera, but the board has documented numerous violations also when authorities arrived to address legitimate concerns. Mr. Thompson became confrontational. Officer Reynolds, whom I noticed at the back of the room, frowned at such description, but remained silent. Thus, Deborah just continued pounding on section of the bylaws shown on screen. I moved towards initiating eviction processes as per bylaw 17.3 for ongoing disruptive behavior and menacing actions towards neighbors and authorities. The room erupted into fragmented reactions. Some nodding, others looked embarrassed. Emma began swaying lightly, her self-soothing mechanism coming in as tensions increased. I stayed up my chair, scraping loudly on the floor. Every head turned. May I speak these accusations? I asked. Voice steady despite the anger coursing through me. Deborah's smile triumphant. 2 minutes? Mr. Thompson, that's all our bylaws require. I went to the front, Emma grudgingly in tow after I whispered reassurance. The walk felt like miles, with dozens of critical eyes upon us. Our movement, my name. Name, James Thompson. I began adding my own folder onto the table prior to addressing these claims. I wished to introduce my daughter properly. This is Emma. She's 12 years old and has level 2 autism with sensory processing differences. Emma waved at me for a second. Her eyes remained on the floor. Several phrases from the crowd softened the violin music you've heard and apparently photographed without permission portion of her therapy program. That was suggested by her development specialist. I pulled out a letter from her doctor and waved it around in my hand. I requested a reasonable accommodation from the HOA 6 weeks ago that Miss Johnson received, but never resolved. Deborah interrupted us. We went over your request and found it unreasonable, which is unlawful under federal law. I cut in my voice, strengthening the Fair Housing Act. Requires HOAs to make reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. Your refusal to proceed through this process is your first lawful infraction. The reporter started writing frantically as whispers erupted again. I just kept drawing papers from my folder. I've also recorded the HOA's selective application of noise ordinances. The weekend bashes at Rodriguez's house consistently go over your decibel limit. Mr. Wilson's motorcycle is in violation of Section 8.2 of your own noise ordinance, but nothing has ever been attempted against them. Deborah flush-faced. Those are completely different. Different because my daughter has autism. I spoke quietly. The room was silent. I breathed deeply, putting a soft hand on Emma's shoulder. What most of you don't know is that I've been a US Marshal for 15 years. Gasps spread through the audience. Even the reporter's pen hesitated mid-sentence. I handle witness protection and am undercover now dealing with domestic terrorism. I went on, I chose Pine Haven Estates because the school system has wonderful support for special needs kids. I didn't make my profession since my job calls for discretion. Emma looked up at me proudly. Something not common in public places. My heart swelled in my line of work. I've learned to document everything. I nodded to Officer Reynolds, who got up, including the fact that Miss Johnson has made false police reports, which Officer Reynolds can verify were blown out of proportion to initiate emergency response. Reynolds cleared his throat. The department has examined the noise complaints and found no violation worth quoting. M. Johnson's description of aggressive behavior is not supported by our report. Deborah's assertive demeanor collapsed. When I created my last document, I filed a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development against discrimination towards a disabled child. I've also documented 7 different violations by this HOA of the American Americans with Disabilities Act. The room erupted. Board members murmured frantically to each other. The reporter approached requesting statements. "You never told us you were police." Deborah finally stuttered her words, barely audible over the hubbub. I inched in closer so she alone might hear me. "And you never inquired whether there was some reason my daughter has to practice her violin. You never made any effort to understand before deploying armed officers to frighten a child with sensory issues. The meeting broke up in chaos as neighbors began fighting amongst themselves. Some came over to us apologizing, others demanded. On Deborah, resignation throughout. Emma remained with me, her hand on my palm, watching in awe as the turn of events shifted as we were making our way toward the door. The reporter stepped out in front of us. "Mr. Thompson, would you tell my daughter she's had it for the day?" I told sternly. "But I shall say this sometimes. The most important fights we engage in are not with criminals, but with individuals who employ rules to intimidate the weak strolling towards our car in the fading evening sun." Emma stopped dead, suddenly. "Are we doing it again?" "Again, Daddy." I dropped down to her height, looking into her troubled eyes. "No, sweetheart, this time, we're not playing. This time we're rewriting the rules. What would come next would test not only my skills as a marshal, but as a father fighting for his daughter's right to belong." The certified letter arrived exactly 3 weeks. After the incendiary HOA meeting, my hands shook slightly as I opened it, preparing myself for another legal battle. Instead, I found an official emergency board election results. I called Emma from her room. "Sweetheart, come see this." She peeked around the corner, violin still in hand. Since the meeting, she'd been practicing indoors, afraid to upset anyone else. The location broke my heart every day. The neighborhood voted. I told her, explaining the outcome. "Deborah isn't running things anymore." Emma read the paper. "Is that your name, Daddy, there?" It was listed under new board members I hadn't run, but clearly enough of my neighbors had signed me in. The concept was both tender and frightening. "Does this mean I can venture out again?" Emma asked, her voice tiny but optimistic. Before I could answer, our doorbell rang. On our porch were 5 of our neighbors that I recognized from the meeting, including Mr. Rivera and a woman that I'd never seen who lived at the bottom of our street. "We owe you and Emma an apology," Mr. Rivera informed us. Taking a step forward, many of us did not know what was happening. The woman standing next to him nodded. "I'm Janet Wilson. My son has ADHD. I know how it feels when people don't understand your child's needs." They gave us a neighborhood petition with over 40 signatures in favor of new housing policies for Pine Haven Estates. My throat tightened. Reading the names. "We need someone who is familiar with rules and justice on the board," Janet continued. "Will you accept the job before I could build a diplomatic refusal?" Emma tugged at my sleeve. "You always tell us we must do something to solve problems, not just complain about them." My own words thrown back at me by my 12-year-old. I couldn't help but laugh. One condition I specified finally. The first item on the agenda is a community education workshop on neurodiversity. 2 months later, I stood in our community center with Emma's developmental specialist, Dr. Martinez, speaking to a full room faces that had once regarded us suspiciously. Now reflected genuine interest. Sensory processing differences mean Emma hears sounds, touches, and lights differently than everybody else. Dr. Martinez described what may be just annoying to you, may be physically painful to her. Emma stronger than I'd ever been illustrated by playing her violin first, normally then with distortion, to illustrate how normal sounds could become overwhelming. But music she controls assists her brain to put all these feelings. Dr. Martinez continued, "It's not just a pastime, it's medication afterwards." 3 families approached us in secret to discuss their own kids' undiagnosed struggles. The community was beginning to open up. Not everybody changed overnight. Deborah still glared whenever she saw us, though the for sale sign in front of her promised she wouldn't be our problem anymore. A few neighbors maintained a distance, uneasy with difference in whatever form. But change arrived in unplanned manners. Janet Wilson organized a neighborhood talent show, with Emma helping smaller children rehearse musical pieces. Mr. Rivera offered his backyard, which was located near a small pond, as a sensory-friendly space for Saturday music sessions. The water naturally dampening sound for nearby homes. The most surprising alley arrived at Mrs. Gonzalez, an old woman who had been initially standing with Deborah's complaints. She knocked on our door one night with cookies that were freshly baked. My late husband had what they call now sensory issues. She confessed to seeing Emma rehearsing through our window. He could not stand certain fabrics or the ringing of silverware against plates. All of them called him difficult. I wish we had not known she began taking her knitting to Emma's weekend rehearsals, stating the music helped ease her arthritis months later, following the altercation. I whiled away my time combing the HOA's ledgers with my new board duty. What I discovered put me right into the county prosecutor's office. "You're certain these discrepancies?" the prosecutor asked. Going through my documents, 15 years of following financial crime for the Marshal Service. I reminded him Deborah channeled nearly $50,000 of HOA funds into personal accounts over 3 years. The landscaping company she hired owned by her brother-in-law at twice market rates. The prosecutor whistled low. No wonder she was so defensive of her authority. "You threatened her whole business." Deborah's arrest made the local news. The same reporter who covered our meeting. Dire connections between her aggressive enforcement and financial motive for doing it. The story spread through neighborhood social media, vindicating what I'd suspected all along. Many of the complaints about Emma had originated from Deborah alone by spring, 6 months after that fateful HOA meeting. Pine Haven Estates had transformed. The new board established clear fair accommodation policies. The vacant lot once headed for an unnecessary parking facility was now a community garden with a small performance area where Emma now taught beginner violin to 3 other neurodivergent children. "Daddy, I need help arranging for the concert." Emma called in our backyard, where we were having a neighborhood barbecue. Nearly 30 neighbors had agreed to our invitation. I was amazed as my daughter, who used to be unable to look at strangers, organized children and adults. Both in pudding chairs, her autism hadn't disappeared, but her self-worth had skyrocketed in a world that embraced and did not penalize her differences. Mrs. Gonzalez arrived early, saving the front row seat. "Your daughter is a blessing to this community," she told me, her eyes watery. We could have lost that blessing because of ignorance and fear, as twilight painted the sky purple. Officer Reynolds and his partner visited this time as guests of honor. Along with their families, Marshall Thompson Reynolds greeted me with a handshake, best noise complaint we ever had. To my son, still can't stop talking about Emma's music lessons. I spotted his little boy around 8, carrying a small violin case, eyes wide with wonder. When Emma finished her solo performance, the backyard exploded in real applause. She beamed, really seen. At last, then she did something I never expected. She invited other children like Reynolds' son to join her in a novice's work. They'd practiced the imperfect but genuine music that rose from our backyard that night brought me to tears. Not because it was flawless, but because it was something deep community based on understanding rather than conformity later on. As neighbors lingered over dessert, Janet approached me with a neighborhood association certificate we named the garden after Emma. She said the board voted unanimously. I stood watching my daughter in the yard, down deep in conversation with another child, both gesturing excitedly about something only they knew in 15 years as a marshal. I said softly, "I've kept witnesses safe from the worst of criminals the country. But watching my daughter fight for her right to simply be as she is, that's been the toughest and most rewarding battle of my life." Janet smiled sometimes. The people who seem hardest to please turn out to give us the best lessons. As stars appeared above us and children laughed, chased fireflies along lawns, no longer divided by suspicion, I knew we'd found something extraordinary. Not a house, but a home, where differences at last were welcome. Not just tolerated, Daddy Emma gasped as I wrapped her in that evening. I'm so glad we didn't take our leave and battle some more. So was I in my line of work. I'd seen what happened when people chose fear over knowledge, but I'd seen the incredible difference that could happen when even one person would not yield to what was wrong tonight in our little corner of Pine Haven Estates. That change would be music, imperfect, beautiful, and well worth every ounce of struggle to create.